In this house, we believe Black Lives Matter. Women's rights are human rights. No human is illegal. Science is real. Love is love. And kindness is everything. There are other lawn signs of this ilk out there as well, some with universal messages, and sadly others with hostile and provocative messages, even occasionally sardonic ones like, "No lives matter, you all suck equally." With the gentler of these and other messages in mind, I contemplated how we might inspire one another in this longed-for and incredible in-person gathering. That, in turn, brought up some fundamental thoughts about what being part of our temple community really is about for me. And that caused me to recall the first time I walked into our building at 1827 California Avenue as the rabbi. It was just after the ratification of the merger between Beth Shalom Temple, the oldest synagogue in Santa Monica, and Temple Shir Shalom, then renting space in the basement of St. Bede's Episcopal Church in Mar Vista. I was the founding rabbi of Temple Shir Shalom, and I'd spent 12 years in an office in the church's basement. And when we did Shabbat services upstairs in the sanctuary, we respectfully shrouded the large cross behind the altar, brought up our portable ark, and plugged in our eternal light, clearly not eternal. So, on that first day after the merger, when our office manager and I walked into 1827, I exclaimed, "Barbara, it's a Jewish building." Among the identifying markers were a Jewish star, a Magen David, on the railing of the steps leading up to the front door, a mezuzah on the front door, and mezuzot on the doorways inside as well. Adorning one wall were photos of confirmation classes dating back to when Moses' kids were confirmed. A classically fashioned Ashkenazi-style ark set deep in the raised bima, the pulpit, and a ner tamid, a permanently lit eternal light, hung suspended above. In the rear of the sanctuary was a yahrzeit wall, with most of the memorial plaques already engraved or reserved for the future. Even though it was my first day as the rabbi in our building, it felt familiar, comfortable, venerable, home. What about all those sacred signs and symbols that made 1827 a Jewish building for me? Some of you have heard me pass on a teaching from my liturgy professor, Rabbi Dr. Larry Hoffman, who said, "The phrase merely symbolic should be stricken from the English language. Things are symbolic or they're not." He firmly believes that once an object or a place is long vested with specific symbolism, either by an individual, a family, or a group of people, especially if customs and rituals reinforce them, others could not blithely strip that symbolism away. And so it was for me with 1827 California. The Torah tells us a story about the earliest distinguishing of Jewish spaces. The tale concerns a non-Jewish soothsayer named Balaam, whom a king hires to curse the Jewish people. Balaam blesses our homes instead. He does not do so of his own volition. He hears the voice of God within him, and the voice mandates that he substitute the curse with the blessing. The words of the blessing are equally well known, perhaps to some of us here. The blessing says, "Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, Mishkenotecha Yisrael, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. Many synagogues have these words written on a wall of their sanctuary, indicating that the place is also a goodly tent, a descendant of the tents of that Balaam viewed as he proclaimed this blessing. And while we don't have the phrase on our walls at 1827, I hope that many, if not most of us, feel that our building is a goodly tent. Our tradition says we can turn the words of the Torah over and over, and we can always find something new in them. This year, I saw something new in this Torah story. I realized the famous words of Ma Tovu were not the only blessing given to the Jewish people by Balaam. The Moabite king Balak took Balaam to 3 different vantage points overlooking the encampment of the Israelites just outside the king's realm, while encouraging Balaam to invoke this curse. Each time, Balaam filled his words with praise and adoration for the Jews and their God. Each time, the king's fury grew hotter, and each time Balaam said, I can only repeat faithfully what Adonai puts in my mouth. There was, of course, a reason why King Balak desired a disabling curse upon the Jewish people. He feared them. The text recounts he knew well of our liberation from Egypt and how God cleared a path for us away from the Egyptians and it enabled us to defeat many other kings and kingdoms along our journey. Balaam clearly states to Balak that this will be Balak and Moab's fate as well, should Balak try to oppose the Israelites and Adonai. After the second curse that became a blessing, Balaam describes our ancient Israelite ancestors like this. Lo, a people that rises like a lioness, leaps up like a lion, rests not till it has feasted on prey and drunk the blood of the slain. Before we become too outraged about what the text tells us about our early history, let us remember who this text's audience really was. It wasn't Balaam, and it wasn't Balak. The target was the fledgling Jewish people, who needed to be assured that God would be with them through their wilderness pilgrimage and beyond. Still, I assume some, if not many of us, don't resonate well with the text telling us that our ancestors drank the blood of their vanquished enemies. Further, for some, our theologies are tainted by cynicism in the wake of the Holocaust and other world events and personal tragedies. We have difficulty believing in a God who defeats our enemies and is omniscient and omnipresent and the guardian of the Jewish people or anyone else. The dissonance produced by the clash of our mores with those of our ancestors might cause us to ask, what can an ancient tale like this do for me in 2022? In the midst of a persistent pandemic, the planet teetering on the edge of climate disaster, and too much of the world in or near the folly of war. The answer both stares us in the face and hides in plain sight, much like the lawn sign we see and forget. We see the answer in the words that Balaam kept saying each time he ignored King Balak's command to curse the Jewish people. Only that which the Eternal designates for my speech must I heed and speak. However, just before the final blessing, Balaam changes his phrasing and says, but I told you, whatever Adonai says, I must do. In this instance, Balaam goes beyond merely reiterating God's dictated words of praise and admiration. Now he's talking about how he feels he must behave. Proclaiming a moral message verbally or on a lawn sign is one thing. Acting in a spiritually inspired manner is quite another. Balaam declares he feels a holy mandate to conduct himself in a particular fashion. Holy mandates of conduct have been the Jewish people's way of being since Egypt. As you probably know, we call them mitzvot, commandments. They define who we are for ourselves and for the world at large. But I believe we have a misperception of the source of those mandates. The traditional perspective is that God gives those commandments, and we, the Jewish people, fulfilling our part of the covenant, respond. In turn, God protects. However, when we see horrible calamities crashing in upon the lives of innocents, a challenge arises, especially for Reform Jews, between the tradition of commander and commanded and the world around us that we understand all too well. God commands, we follow, God shelters and defends, doesn't seem to work very well. We can either face this challenge or walk away. Many of us have already thrown in the towel and thrown up our hands in frustration, even anger, at a theological construct that appears unfair and harsh. We feel no obligation to adhere to what the tradition says are divine mandates because divine recognition for our compliance seems completely absent. Moreover, the dense shadow of the Holocaust shatters the belief that fulfilling the commandments translates into God being our shield. How many thousands of observant Jews did the Nazis slaughter whose faithfulness should have saved them? However, later Jewish tradition argues that we should not expect a response from God when we light candles for Shabbat or decide not to have a bacon cheeseburger. In Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our sages, we are advised that our actions will not result in some sort of compensation. Antigonus of Socho, speaking from the teachings of Shimon the Righteous, says, "Do not be like servants who serve a master in the expectation of receiving a reward." Yehuda Hanasi says, "You do not know the reward for the fulfillment of the commandments." And finally, a rabbi with the great name of Ben Hehe goes even further, saying, effort is its own reward. For one of my favorite teachers, Rabbi Rami Shapiro, this means the reward for your effort is the effort itself. Do not imagine that you will earn something at the end of your life. Your life is the gift. There is no point to living. Living is the point. There is no purpose to living. Living is the purpose. As long as you imagine that doing leads to getting, you will never appreciate the act of doing. Here's an example of from my rabbinate's early years of the kind of reward Rabbi Shapiro elucidates. In 1987, then Governor George Deukmejian signed a bill granting tax rebates to Californians totaling $1.1 billion. As soon as I became aware of this windfall we were all about to receive, I asked Temple Shir Shalom whether they would join me in signing over their checks to the temple so that we could, in turn, give the money to the homeless and poor. A significant percentage of our members did so, one of whom, Leonard Vine, volunteered to make a giant Publishers Clearinghouse-style check to present to a local agency. And shortly thereafter, we handed that check to a local social service agency during a Shabbat service. Such a reward happened again 4 years later, almost immediately after the merger. Two longtime Beth Shalom members, Doris and Nordy Smirlock, who volunteered weekly for Meals on Wheels, approached me with a concern. They said, Meals on Wheels doesn't operate on Christmas Day. And they thought the newly formed Beth Shir Shalom should take over. And so we did. And so we've continued to do for 31 years. Why did we do these things? That California tax rebate was rightfully ours to keep and spend individually. No one told us to give the funds away. Instead, we did it because we felt an internal spiritual and social mandate. Likewise, Nordy, Doris, and the countless volunteers over 3 decades who made a Christmas Day meal for Meals on Wheels clients felt a call from their kishkas. The soothsayer Balaam might say, well, God told them to do it. I don't think that all or even most of those who gave and continue to give feel that. Instead, a sense arose in this community, creating a determination that something barely seen as a possibility needed to become a must. That legacy rests on our shoulders and our hearts. What are our musts? Where are the places we must show up? What are the actions we must take, the petitions we must sign, the letters we must write, the social responsibilities we must take on? We may look no further than a lawn sign for the answer, but there's a Jewish version of these notions that I believe should be the lawn sign of our building at 1827 California, and perhaps all of our homes as well. Our version is gleaned from the Mishnah and the Talmud, our oldest rabbinic Torah commentaries. Versus the now ubiquitous emblem, this lawn sign doesn't say, in this house we believe. Instead, it says, in this house we must do. So the sign I envision would say, these are our actions. Their value is priceless. In and outside this house, we respect the past, and in it implant new seeds. Act with loving kindness. Engage in lifelong education. Welcome the stranger. Celebrate all loving families. Honor the circle of life. Pray with our hands, our hearts, our breath, our minds, our ears, our eyes, our mouths, and our legs. Much as I felt the impact of those Jewish symbols that first day at 1827, I was wrong. What defines Beth Shir Shalom as a Jewish community is not the various accoutrements and the accessories commonly extant in Jewish buildings. It's not our beliefs either. It's what we do. Our synagogue isn't a goodly Jewish tent because we're in it. Our tent is goodly because of how we choose to behave in it and what we do from it outside its walls. Here, in this beautiful moment, as we meet in person for the first time in 2 years for our holiest days, we lift up our values and mandates and commit ourselves to the actions that make us a Jewish community, the Beth Shir Shalom community. From the depths of my heart, I wish you a good year, reflective, fulfilling, and healthy. Shana Tova.